When we navigate around the forum, now that we fetch all our data asynchronously, we see that the data appears in random order, causing the forum to look weird. I'm thinking that it would be nice to have everything in place before we display the contents of the page to the user. In the meantime, while we are waiting for the data, we should display a loading indicator or a progress bar. This requires quite a bit of work, so let's do it in baby steps. The first step will be to hide the component's template until its data is fetched. To do that, we'll use a data property in each component, like ready, that will switch between true and false. Based on that value, we'll hide or show the component's contents. I will start with the home page. I will add the ready data and set it to false. Then, I will wrap our content in a single root element and apply a VIF to it. Now we have to set ready to true when all the data is fetched. In the components created hook, we fetch all the categories and their forums. We do that by dispatching the fetch all categories action and the fetch forums action. Let's add an await to fetch forums so that we know when it's finished. Then, after we know everything is loaded in, we can set ready to true. Awesome. This time, the categories and the forums are displayed together at one time. We want to implement this functionality on all our pages, but it would be a maintenance nightmare if we hard-coded this ready state into each page from scratch. In the next lesson, we'll scale our solution and implement it on all the pages. As we hid the template for the home page component until its data is fetched, we want to hide the template for all pages. We can, of course, repeat what we did in the previous lesson for all page components, but that's not ideal. We have a couple of options for making this functionality available in multiple components. One option is to use Vuex. Store the ready data and update it using actions and mutations. Another option is to create a base page component and extend it. Also, this is a common use case for mixins. All of these options are fine. For the sake of this example, we will use mixins. Mixins are a flexible way to distribute reusable functionalities in Vue components. A mixin is an object that contains any component options, like data or methods. When a component uses a mixin, all options in the mixin will be mixed into the component's own options. Let me show you. First, I will create a mixins directory inside the source folder. Here, we will create our mixin, which we will name something like page component mixin, or maybe async data status. From the mixin, we want to export an object with the options. To begin with, we can add the data option that will include the ready property. To use our mixin in the home page, we have to import it and specify it in the component's mixins option, which is an array. Now we can remove the data from the component, and hopefully, back in the browser, the home page will work as it did before. And it did. In the home page component, we set ready to true directly when all the data is fetched, though it is more elegant to create a method in the mixin to do that, since in the future we might want to do more things when the data is fetched. For instance, we might need to emit an event. Thus, I will create a method that I'd like to name fetched. It's recommended to prefix all properties of a mixin to avoid conflicts with the component's properties. For example, ready is a property name that you or any other developer might use on a component that uses our mixin. I will use the mixin name as the prefix, and I will separate it using an underscore, so that the ready property will now be async data status ready. We will do the same for the fetched method. In here, we just want to set ready to true. Let's get back to our component and use our new properties. When the data is ready, we'll call the fetched method. We also have to update the ready property on our VIF. This convention might feel a bit frustrating, but we not only guarantee that the mixin's properties won't produce conflicts, but also it's straightforward to find where the option is defined. If we were using, for example, 5 mixins in this component, we would have to guess or go over all mixins to find where the ready property is declared. Okay, with the mixin in place, we can go through the page components that get data asynchronously and hide their contents until the data is fetched. These pages are the category page, the forum page, the thread create, edit, and show page. For the user related page, we will come back soon when we implement authentication. To get started, I will import the mixin into these components. Then, I will define the mixins property. Next, we have to add the VIF on the root elements to hide their contents until the data is ready. In many components, we were hiding the template until a property, like the forum, was fetched. We don't need that anymore, since the ready property guarantees that we have all the data. Lastly, we have to call the fetched method coming from the mixin when all the calls are done. We'll make sure we have awaited all action calls and then call fetched. Okay, looks good. Let's browse our forum to ensure that we didn't break anything. Awesome. This time, all the contents show up together. In the next lesson, we will conditionally display the page components to show a loading indicator while the data is being fetched. In the previous lesson, we hid the page components templates until their data is fetched. As a result, we see a blank page while we are waiting for the data. We can go a step further now and display a loading indicator until we eventually display the components template. If we were to do that in each component separately, we'd conditionally display the contents or the loading based on the value of ready. This works fine, but we don't want to repeat this functionality in every component. And when at some point down the road we want to update the loading message, we don't want to update it in every component. Though, if you are building a small application with only a couple of pages where the markup hierarchy is flexible, this approach is fine. There are a couple of elegant ways to share this functionality between all the page components. The one I like the best is to conditionally display the router view element. In case you didn't know it, the router view component coming from Vue router renders the match component for any given path. In other words, this component is the one that renders all of our page components based on the URL. Thus, in app.view, we can conditionally display the router view or the loading. I will remove the logic from the home page and replicate it there. Let's say we have a show page property that we will base our statement on. I will add the show page property and set it to false by default. Next, we have to set show page to true when the active page component has fetched the data. To notify app.view from the page component when the data is fetched, we will emit a custom event. We can set up an event listener on router view for the event, let's say ready. When the data is fetched, we set the show page variable to true. Next, we have to emit this event from the page components. All these components call the fetched method from our mixin when they are done. So, here is the right place to emit the ready event. Let's review what we have done. In the page components, like home, we call the fetched method of the mixin when the asynchronous calls are done. In this method, we emit the ready event. And in app.view, we listen for this event, and when it happens, we set show page to true, and we hopefully display the contents of the component. If we check it in the browser, it looks like we're stuck loading. This happens because we are rendering router view using vif, which means that the component is not rendered unless show page is true. So, if we check View DevTools, only the app and the navbar components are being rendered. In order to set show page to true and eventually display the page, we need to render the component first so that it fetches the data and emits the event. To solve that, we will conditionally display the element using vShow instead of vIf. The difference between vIf and vShow is that vIf will render the element when the statement is true, and otherwise it will remove it from the DOM. On the other hand, vShow will always render the element and keep it in the DOM, and conditionally update the CSS display property to either show or hide the element. In general, vIf has higher toggle costs, while vShow has higher initial render costs. Thus, prefer vShow if you need to toggle something very often, and prefer vIf when the condition is unlikely to change at runtime. Because vShow doesn't support vElse, I will add a vShow to the loading div and show it when showPage is false. Here, we could also use vIf and render the loading conditionally, though because we will toggle the visibility of the loading every time we navigate to a page, it's cheaper to render the element once and hide it conditionally using vShow. Back in the browser, we now see the loading message and then the contents of the page. Though, if we navigate to another page, we still see it empty until the data is fetched. This happens because we set show page to true the first time a component is ready, but we never reset it to false. Because the first-store calls are fast, we don't really get the time to realize what's going on. To help us, I will delay all the calls by setting a timeout before resolving the promise in fetch item, which is the base action that all fetches rely on. Now, in the browser, we have some time to grasp the flow. So, you see that show page is false in the beginning on a fresh reload. Then it becomes true and never changes back. The time when we want to reset it is right before we navigate to another page. To run code before navigating to another page, we can take advantage of view routers before each method. Inside app.view, in the created hook, we can access the router under this.router. So here we can call before each and pass in a callback. Inside the callback, we want to set show page to false. If we check back in the browser, our loading works like a charm, though the page components that do not fetch asynchronous data, like the not found page, will never show up. This happens because they do not emit the ready event, and show page never becomes true. Let's fix that. Here, we can use our mixin, but we can also just emit the event in a component's lifecycle hook, like the created. In the next lesson, we will get rid of the boring loading text and replace it with a cool loading spinner. In the previous lesson, we added a loading message. it's time to replace it with a cool spinner. There are dozens of libraries to set you up with spinners. For our case, I have picked SpinKit. SpinKit is a library that offers many spinners that you can install through npm or by just grabbing the spinner you like from their website. I will do that since we don't really need to install a library to use just one spinner. I will create a component for our spinner. This is a base component, and thus I will name it App Spinner to be multi-worded and comply with the style guide. In the template, I'll place the markup we got from SpinKit. And next, copy the CSS in the style tag. I'll also make it scoped since the styles only apply to this component. Here, we can easily change the color of the spinner, so I will change it to the forum blue. Let's use it now in app.vue. Since the component name starts with app, it's considered a global component and is already registered for us in the main.js file, so we can just go ahead and use it in the template. Back in the browser, we now see our spinner while we wait for the data. In the next lesson, we will implement the progress bar. Even though our spinner is just fine, we can make our application even fancier by displaying a slim progress bar right before the nav bar. In Progress is a great library that provides exactly that. It's also straightforward to use, requiring a call to a .start method to start the progress bar and a call to end to stop it. Let's get to it. I will install it using npm. Now we can import it in app.vue. We also have to import its CSS inside the style tag. Here, we can use the tilde shorthand to point to the node modules directory, and then navigate to In Progress CSS. Good. We want to start the timer every time we are about to visit a page, thus in the before each router method. Next, we want the progress to complete when the page component is ready. We have an event listener for that, so I will create a method, something like onPageReady, and move the previous code here. When the page is ready, we should also complete the progress bar. Thus, here we will call inProgress.done. Let's check it out in the browser. It works great. Cool. Though it feels a bit slow, and the spinner on the right is a little bit excessive. We can configure these before we start the timer using the configure method. I will set the speed to 200 milliseconds. and hide the spinner using the Show Spinner option. Next up, I don't really like the color of the bar. There is no option to change that, but we can target the element using the hashtag progress.bar and set the background to the color that we'd like. Okay, let's give it another go. Great, it feels a little nicer this time. Now that we've got the loaders in place, let's remove the timeout from the fetch item action we added earlier. And it's fast again. I can barely see the spinner, but it's still there and will be especially important for slow connections.